The first time I touched a computer, I was 10 years old in 1980 at my friend Eric's house, who lived down the street. Eric's dad was a manager at Hughes Aircraft, the same place my dad was a draftsman. They knew each other, but there was an obvious white-collar, blue-collar divide between them. My dad said Eric's dad was kicked upstairs, which I think implied he was incompetent. So they promoted him? It always sounded like sour grapes on my dad's part to me. My dad was into dirt bikes and fixing cars. Eric's dad was into technology, sci-fi, and building his wife a kiln and his son a 2-story clubhouse. My dad showed me how to fix a roof, do a brake job on a Datsun 710, shoot guns, and how to set off fireworks without blowing my hand off. He never built my mom anything I can recall, but he did once hang a tire from a tree so we could swing on it. My dad was into the Civil War, cowboys, ghost towns, and discovering the past. Eric's dad showed me the future. I can't imagine why now, but Eric's dad let my brother and I, a grimy set of twins with rat's nest hair and threadbare clothes, touch his shiny, brand new Apple II computer. He let us play games like Ceiling Zero and Aztec, but he did something more. It was Eric's dad who showed us how to enter and execute our first real, honest-to-God, Apple basic code executing on its MOS Technology 6502-based processor. It went something like this. 10. Print. Hello world. 20. Go to 10. When the program ran, the rippling green phosphorescent text scrolled on the black background of the Apple II monitor. It went on and on forever, and it appeared to be the stuff of gods to me. By typing the code Eric's dad showed us, then typing run and hitting the enter key, we had essentially created what appeared to be life itself. And just like those same gods, Eric's dad showed us how to smite that life down with a simple Control-C key press. I was gobsmacked. I was hooked. My eyes instantly opened to a world I had no concept of even existing before. A world I never wanted to leave, but a world I rarely got the chance to enter.
Programmed in BASIC, we explored 8-bit worlds. Pixels crashed onto a digital shore. All our records were scratched. Left alone, we were latchkey children, terrified of nuclear war. In the glow of the cathode ray, every game we play on our 2600. Into the vertical blank, our highest scores have been ranked. Into the vertical blank, generation Atari.
The first time I ever saw a video game being played was at the Old Town Mall in Torrance, California in about 1976. My dad took us there to see a revival showing of the movie Westworld, a movie about computerized robots that become sentient and attack guests at a futuristic amusement park. It was cool, but also disappointing. Like most 1970s sci-fi, it was claustrophobic, and the story left me wanting more. However, the events that followed the movie left a stamp on my brain that never disappeared. To get back to our car, we took a shortcut through the arcade. I'd never been inside an arcade for more than a few seconds before. The lights and sounds coming from the games were intoxicating, and I always wondered what they were about. On that particular day, instead of just rushing through, my dad spied a machine and stopped. It was Wild Gunman by Nintendo. An enormous film-based game, Wild Gunman challenged a human to put on a realistic-looking holster and a realistic-looking gun and shoot at realistic-looking bad guys on a giant screen in front of you. My dad, who was haunted by a childhood of abuse and dreamed about himself as a silent hero like Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name, could not pass it up. He inserted quarters and the game sprang to life. The filmed cowboys reminded me of the robots from Westworld, and it was hard not to make a connection to the movie. It was just the mid-1970s, but as my dad played Wild Gunman, I felt like the virtual world of Westworld was just around the corner from us. I felt it in my gut. This was somehow, some way, my future. My dad finished his game and we left the mall to drive home, but the arcade, Wild Gunman, and Westworld, they never left me.
You're going to end up on Skid Row. My dad was serious. My brother and I were 11 years old, listening to my dad as we drove the Datsun 710 station wagon to a Motel 6 in Escondido, California. This was a weekend trip, the type of which we'd taken for the past few years. It constituted our family summer vacations in totality. If you don't find a decent job, you're going to be living on the streets. It was a scary thought, living on the streets. The hot, sticky vinyl of the Datsun seats that I hated so much felt like a dream compared to how I imagined sleeping in a concrete sidewalk. In the summer of 1981, my brother and I were video game obsessed twins who lived in a household that avoided or could not afford most modern technology and conveniences. My dad's job at Hughes Aircraft was shaky, and we made ends meet based on how many overtime hours he was awarded there. This meant most luxuries were off the table. It was lucky then that we both loved arcade games that we could play for 25 cents apiece. However, we also coveted the Atari VCS, a machine on which we could play unlimited video games, but was so far not within our grasp. When we had money, we spent most of it at the arcade or in shop fronts, playing coin-operated video games whenever possible. Most of the time, those games are made by one company, the aforementioned VCS creator, Atari. When we were not in the arcade, we were on the lookout for any kind of video games, favoring the Atari VCS system set up in the TV departments of various stores like FedMart, Gemco, and Sears. When we found one, we could play a few rounds before the salesman ran us off. On a trip like this one to San Diego, we would hopefully find an arcade at our miniature golf course and beg our dad to take us there. He would usually oblige. "You can't make the same mistakes I made," my dad continued. We listened to his conversations enough to know exactly what he was talking about. Our father had a degree in fine art from Syracuse University, and after spending 25 years trying to land acting roles in TV, he now held a job doing drafting work for an aerospace company. If anyone did, my dad knew the value of not wasting a college education. But he constantly complained about his job and warned us about getting into a bad work situation. "Most of your work lives will be spent dealing with boredom," he told us. He hated his work. That much was obvious. It certainly wasn't what he dreamed of doing when he imagined himself in the French Foreign Legion as a boy, or acted on the show Captain Zero in the 50s. His warning always stayed with me. Would I be able to find a job I loved, not be bored, and avoid ending up on Skid Row? It was a lot for an 11-year-old to contemplate.
There are two basic periods that existed in the life of many kids like me who grew up in the 70s. Before Star Wars and after Star Wars. That's it. It's hard to explain if you're not there. Star Wars is ubiquitous in 2023, as is most nerd culture. But in 1977, this was not the case. Fantasy as an escape for adults was mostly limited to Star Trek reruns and Sunday afternoon horror movie marathons. Everything else in the 70s was so damn serious. Vietnam ending, Nixon resigning, civil rights battles, the gas crisis, the Iran hostages, and the constant threat of nuclear war. As kids, our heroes were guys who lived in the margins, like Burt Reynolds in Smokey the Bandit, Evel Knievel, and Fonzie. Everything in life appeared to live in a gray area, someplace, somewhere, between good and evil. The future as imagined by most sci-fi movies at the time was one of disaster and dystopia and technology gone awry. It was all on display in 2001: A Space Odyssey, Planet of the Apes, Logan's Run, and Westworld. All the movies seemed to tell me that technology was my enemy, that it was evil, that it was to be avoided. So either by chance or circumstance, my brother and I did avoid it. Most of our lives were spent almost completely analog. A TV here, a radio there, but mostly no technology at all. We made up games and played outside. It was fun, but it felt incomplete, like there was a big puzzle piece missing, but I had no idea what it might be. Then Star Wars came. At first, I didn't even care to see it. Sci-fi was boring to me. I'd rather see chaotic neutral truckers run from cops like in Smokey and the Bandit. But I still recall the day I saw Star Wars and every detail about it. It was at South Bay General Cinemas No. 1. It was in July 1977. I was 7 years old. My sister and brother and mom and dad were there. We got popcorn. We sat about 3 rows from the back. I can remember every second of the movie. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. A simple fable of dark versus light. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, or really since. But my mind exploded. George Lucas gave me something, or maybe everything, to believe in. From the first frame to the last, I was completely taken by it. A fantasy world that made everything or anything seem possible. Every moment of kid life after seeing Star Wars was spent thinking about Star Wars, wanting to return to see Star Wars, but we never saw movies twice. So instead, I thought about its implications, its stories, its technology. In Star Wars, the technology was not evil. It just existed, and it could be used for whatever purposes people had designs on. Star Wars was the spark for everything else to come.
Not too long after we returned from our weekend away, my brother and I stumbled across a computer store named HW Computers next to a laundromat my mom was trying out for the first time. HW was part of a chain established among the first wave of computer stores. The shop was a mishmash of t-shirted techies, business-suited sales guys, IBM clones, Apple IIs, and walls filled with elaborately shaped boxes of software and games. When we saw the Atari logo on the front of the store, we begged our mom to take us there while the clothes were in the washer. Our mission that day, as it had been for a long time, was to look for Atari VCS games to see if we could play them. And we did find some VCS games, but they were unplayable in a glass case. But it was still exciting to find them. However, we also found something better, something amazing to me at the time. In another glass case at HW Computers, we saw a display of one of the most beautiful creations I'd ever witnessed. An Atari 800 computer and 810 disk drive. Atari made computers, I said? I had no idea, my brother replied. As the computer store salesman explained the machines and how much more powerful they were than the VCS and how much cheaper they were than the Apple II, I was dumbfounded by their beauty. The sleek curves of the Atari computers reminded me of the cars from the movie American Graffiti. I felt a charge in my gut when I looked at them, as if they were something I needed to possess as soon as possible. I'm not sure why exactly the name Atari attached to a computer made these seem more accessible than Apple, but it just did. I already had an innate love for anything Atari because I loved playing the Asteroids coin-op so much, and I'd wanted an Atari VCS for so long after falling in love with Breakout. Maybe, in my head, expensive Apple computers were for kids of engineering managers and math geniuses like Eric, while Atari was made for kids who might one day end up on Skid Row. I really can't explain it other than the name Atari, attached to a computer, made my brother and I both think one day it would be possible to own one. We left the store that day with a catalog listing all the Atari computer software available at HW Computers, and a sneaking suspicion it would not be the last time we crossed the path of Atari computing machines. Admittingly, a big draw I had towards computers was the fact that they could play the in-depth and exciting games we saw in the store and described in the software catalog. After using Eric's Apple II, I was enamored by the process of booting the machine, inserting a disk in the floppy drive, typing a command, and running a game. The sound of the whirring disk and the audible clicks as each sector of bits was loaded from the floppy drive was thrilling. But equally thrilling was the basic programming language Eric's dad had showed us how to use. With seemingly the same commands and interface used to play games, a person could write these magical lines of text capable of making games as well. The difference between playing software and creating software appeared to be a mere matter of context, a magical flick of the wrist that could take a person from shooting aliens to breathing life into them. All those years we spent trying to make homemade pinball games in the garage with mechanical parts and lights that my dad pilfered from work, designing our own driveway sports, or hacking our analog toys into interactive experience were leading to something, and a programmable home computer felt like maybe an answer. Furthermore, if my brother and I could only get our hands on an Atari computer and learn to program one, then there was a good chance we would one day get a job making video games. At least that's how we saw it. And if we did learn to program and make video games, my dad would never have to worry about us ending up on Skid Row. I would never have to worry about ending up on Skid Row. That was the dream anyway. But dreams, by my parents' example, dreams are not always an achievable reality. Both of them lived with the constant knowledge that their own ambitions of becoming professional actors would never come to fruition. We only heard snatches of their lives before us kids came along, but it all sounded so fascinating. They met by chance in San Francisco in the 50s and acted together in plays in the San Francisco State Little Theater. After my dad got roles on a couple TV shows, they chased their dream to New York to study the method under Paul Mann. After graduating from acting school, they moved back to 1950s Hollywood to chase the TV dream once more. Then, nothing. It all evaporated. To make ends meet, my dad took a job drawing for an aerospace company, and my mom worked as a typist for Rand Corporation. When the first baby came not soon after, the acting was put on hold indefinitely. My dad found things to keep himself busy, but my mom? She never really did. She just sat at one side of the kitchen table, playing solitaire for hours on end. The same version of Klondike over and over. Klondike for my entire childhood and beyond. Her dreams died hard. So to me, having a big dream for your life just seemed like a terrible idea. You'd end up on Skid Row, in a job you hate, or sitting by yourself wondering what could have been. I never really imagined being anything beyond my then current position, a kid who loved Star Wars and video games. But this Atari computer thing, it seemed like it was a dream worth having. It was short term. It was achievable. Maybe. Sure, computers, even cheap Atari computers, were expensive. But there had to be a way to make it happen.
The first time I played an Atari VCS was in 1978. It was a religious experience, literally. My brother and I began our Catholic CCD classes for First Communion that year, and our mom made a deal with another mom up the street so we could carpool. She was the mom of a second grade girl. The first day, my brother and I walked up to their house, and then all three of us went to play in her bedroom before class. Carrie was 1 year younger than us. Her mom was divorced and worked in technology at the local GTE telephone office. I'm not sure if any of those details were important at all, but Carrie's room was filled with the most amazing set of technology toys I'd ever seen. The 2XL talking robot, the speak and spell electronic game. She had her own TV, and attached to that TV was an Atari VCS game console. Surrounding the console on the floor were boxes with magnificent paintings on the cover, brightly colored and filled with mystery. They showed illustrations of furious scenes of war, dynamic car races, and space battles. Space battles like the ones in Star Wars. The brightly colored boxes reminded me of the books I was holding, the 4 Catholic Gospels we needed for class, also brightly colored, also filled with mystery. We played games of combat, air-sea battle, street racer, and starship that day. Then we returned the next week and the next. Carrie became one of our best friends. For 30 minutes or so a week, my brother and I got to live someone else's life, a digital world we could only dream of having ourselves. It was not hard to imagine playing Star Wars when playing the Atari VCS. The battles we fought, the streets we raced, and the starships we flew connected to that movie in a way that is difficult to describe in the 21st century, when there was such an abundance of fantasy and technology. But in 1978, in a visceral and immersive way, playing Atari in Carrie's room was like living in Star Wars. After that, every time I played any type of video game, no matter what it was, some part of my mind, no matter how minuscule, pretended it was Star Wars. When Carrie's birthday came around in 1979, she received a copy of Breakout for the Atari VCS, and with that game, I found myself addicted to a video game for the first time. The hypnotic sound, the motion combined with the smooth movement of the paddle helped me develop my first bit of muscle memory ever achieved with any type of gaming experience. But it was short-lived. After First Communion, Carrie moved from public school to private school, and then we had no reason to hang out anymore. After we stopped going to Carrie's house, the Atari VCS just kind of melted away. We were back in our analog home with almost no technology. It will be several years before the possibility of owning our own became a reality.
The vertical blank. In 1953, in North America, the NTSC, National Television Systems Committee, standardized cathode ray tube CRT color TV television sets to be totally backwards compatible with black and white TVs. The standard ran at 60 Hz, or in other words, refreshed the screen 60 times a second. Inside each refresh were 2 interlaced frames, which created an effective frame rate of 30 FPS frames per second. Each frame had a horizontal resolution of 262.5 horizontal lines, but when the interlaced frames were swapped on every other line, it made an effective resolution of 525 horizontal lines. However, not all of these lines could be used. The TV needed time to reset itself after drawing the requisite 525 lines in one cycle, so the number of horizontal lines was reduced to 480. This left 45 cycles at the end of one frame before the start of the next, when the CRT electron gun would move back into position to start drawing the next interlaced frame. The gun moved vertically, back up to its starting position, at the top left of the CRT. During this period, nothing new was displayed on the screen. It was effectively blank. This became known as the vertical blanking period. the vertical blank. Video game programmers back in the day used the vertical blank period to make calculations in code for what would occur on the next frame. It was where the magic happened, off-screen and between the lines. My older sisters loved punk rock music, and one of those bands, Richard Hell and the Voidoids, had a song named The Blank Generation, which went something like this. I belong to the blank generation, and I can take it or leave it each time. I belong to the blank generation, but I can take or leave it each time. The song was about the 70s punk rock movement breaking down walls, and that the generation of Richard Hell could use that blank space to be whatever they wanted to be. But I was a younger age, born in the 1970s, and for me, our generation was all about Star Wars and video games. So maybe my part of Generation X was not the blank generation at all, but instead the vertical blank generation. Vertical blankers, like me, were struck by the nuances of flicking Atari-age graphics displayed many times a second. We see them when we close our eyes. We hear the beeping sounds of the Atari VCS TIA sound chip in our dreams. This was not a question of subliminal messages or being hypnotized by the TV. This was something else. Between those lines, we saw opportunity. Between those lines, we saw possibility. Between those lines, we saw the future.
For most of the 1970s, my dad rode desert motocross as his pastime and hobby. He joined a club for desert motocross racers named the Dusters and spent many of his free weekends in the Mojave Desert. We accompanied him a couple times, but there was little for us to do. I always secretly wanted to be a duster. They had their own custom jerseys, and they gave out trophies to their members. My dad proudly displayed his club-awarded first-placed aged 50-plus trophy next to his bed. Next to it was an action photo of him riding in the desert. When an accident forced my dad to quit motocross racing, he picked up a new hobby, collecting military artifacts, specifically forge caps from the American Civil War. It wasn't exactly a new hobby, as he'd been interested in them since the 1950s when he saw one in a store for $5 and passed it up. He kicked himself ever since. The forge caps from the American Civil War looked very much like the hats worn by the French Foreign Legion, and my dad connected the two from his own childhood aspirations to run away and fight foreign wars. In a matter of months, he purchased several hats, either from the local gun shows or from Shotgun News magazine, a publication for gun enthusiasts that doubled as classified ads for military memorabilia. He even wore one of the hats as he coached our soccer team, sticking out like a sore thumb among the young beach dads in our hometown. A couple months after seeing the Atari 800 in the glass case, the first issue of Electronic Games magazine was published, and it made its way into the hands of my brother and I. Even though we still had computers in our minds, the Atari VCS was never forgotten, and the first issue of Electronic Games brought it right back to the forefront. We pored over the entire magazine for weeks, geeking out at the images and descriptions of the cartridges coming out for the Atari VCS. The visceral nature of the magazine made the prospect of getting an Atari VCS feel more real than ever. We talked about the VCS constantly and made it obvious to our parents that we could no longer wait. So when Christmas 1981 rolled by, somehow, they managed to get one for us. To this day, I still don't understand how. Civil War forge caps cost several $100s at the time, so maybe my mom convinced my dad to postpone the purchase of a hat or two to get us an Atari? More likely, though, it was probably made possible by my mom, who had recently rejoined the workforce as a near minimum wage teacher's aide. No matter how we got the VCS, it was amazing to have. We were finally Atari owners and not just Atari players. And for a while, the dreams of owning an Atari computer were pushed aside as we went full bore into playing the VCS and getting all the new games reviewed and advertised in Electronic Games magazine. This was our true video game golden age. We spent all of our money on Electronic Games magazine, arcade tokens, and Atari cartridges. We really tried to make the VCS the best it could be, to embrace it as the future. We subscribed to Atari Age magazine and acquired copies of Night Driver, Missile Command, and Adventure for our 12th birthday. However, the excitement was short-lived. It might have been amazing to have an Atari VCS, but it wasn't necessarily amazing to play an Atari VCS. While we were wowed by games like Asteroids and Missile Command, we were left disappointed by many others. The blockiness of Adventure and the sheer hollowness of Pac-Man, for example, made us take pause. When the next generation ColecoVision and Atari 5200 were announced in Electronic Games magazine in 1982, the VCS felt old and tired. What was cool when I was in 3rd grade in 1978 felt outdated and underpowered in an era of MTV and Tron. We watched our friends get these newer machines. while we were stuck with a device designed when Nixon jokes still echoed on late-night TV. We so desperately wanted to be on the cutting edge of technology, but in reality, our family situation meant we would always be coming from behind, trying to catch up to the modern world. Computers, on the other hand, still seemed new and exciting. When I wasn't playing the VCS, I was usually in my room, lying on my bed, reading the Computer Playland section of electronic games, or paging through that Atari software catalog from HW Computers. As the months and years wore on, the games in that catalog took on a mythic quality. Their tantalizing names and descriptions felt so much deeper and more exciting than the mostly one-note gameplay of the Atari VCS. Energy Czar, Eastern Front, Temple of Apshai, Rescue at Regal, Caverns of Mars, Scott Adams Adventures, and Zork, just to name a few. All those games sounded like the deep and engrossing experiences I wanted from the VCS, but were so hard to find. It was around that time that somehow, someway, using our twin powers, my brother and I decided in unspoken terms that we both wanted, no, needed, to somehow, someway rekindle the dream and get an Atari computer in any way possible. So over the next couple years, we schemed and scouted all avenues to obtain what was fast becoming the pinnacle of our childhood dreams. Knowing how expensive computers were at the time, the salesman who told us the Atari 100 and disk drive would set us back at least $1,000. We knew we were going to have to be mighty creative in our endeavors if we were ever going to see our plans come to fruition. Sure, my dad didn't want us to end up on Skid Row, but he also didn't want to end up on Skid Row himself trying to buy a computer. To be successful, we'd have to present the computer as a device so necessary for our collective futures that there was no way he could pass up the opportunity to get one for us. The first thing we did was educate ourselves. For a couple kids who did fine in school, but would rather read Encyclopedia Brown, Three Investigators, and Choose Your Own Adventure books, this was quite a startling change of direction. We checked out books on basic programming from the library and taught ourselves the main tenets of the basic language from the seeds Mr. Barth planted years before. Line numbers, loops, go-tos, go-subs, plot and color statements. Soon we are fashioning our own analog programs on notebook and graph paper, designing games and graphics and anything else we could think of. We did these things out in the open, where our parents could see our work. Sitting across the table from my mom while she played another losing game of one-person cards, we copied code from books and discussed out loud how we might create the coding ideas in our head. Among the supplies my dad brought home from his work at Hughes Aircraft were a few pages of 1/8-inch graph paper. To us, the boxes on that graph paper looked just like the pixels on an 8-bit Apple II screen. We asked to borrow some of the paper, and the next day he brought us a whole stack he borrowed from the Hughes Aircraft supply closet. Nobody was using it, he told us. On that paper, we designed the spaceships and characters we planned to use in the games we wrote for our future Atari computer. We even inserted plot statements directly on the graph paper, so when we eventually got a computer, we could easily replicate the graphics we designed. We had no way to test out our ideas, but that didn't stop us from imagining the possibilities of what a computer could do. Along the way, the unspoken agreement among my brother and I evolved. We didn't just want to get a computer to program video games. We both hoped this would all one day lead to our ultimate goal, working at Atari, making video games, because they were, hands down, the world's greatest video game company. Skid Row, it was nowhere in the picture. Time continued to march on, and as with BMX bikes, skateboards, and video game systems before them, we, again, watched the years pass by as our friends in the neighborhood all obtained the same things we wanted so badly but seemed so far out of our reach. First, Eric's dad upgraded to an Apple IIe. Then Wesley's dad bought him an IBM PC compatible. Next, Kenny's mom, who was a single parent, managed to get him an Atari 400, followed by Scott's parents, who scored him a TRS-80. I was happy for those guys, but frustrated too. It just seemed like the more we wanted something, the better chance someone else would get it. The reality was, being familiar with how to program a computer did not mean we would ever own one. If our plan was going to work, we would have to start really working on getting a machine into our house. Our first solid chance came in the summer of 1982. That year, McDonald's had an Atari video game scratch and win contest, giving away thousands of Atari products, including Atari 5200s and Atari computers. We resigned ourselves that summer to win that contest by any means necessary. In between stints at the arcade that offered 8 tokens for $1, we would walk up to the local McDonald's looking for discarded game cards on the ground, on tables, and on floors inside the restaurant. When that left us empty-handed, we braved discarded Big Macs and soggy fries as we searched through the trash cans in and outside the restaurant. We did this for a few hours a day, a few days a week, for at least half the summer. To this day, the scent of lettuce and tomatoes mixed with special sauce together conjure up memories of picking through the garbage in me. Lukewarm McDonald's garbage. Out of the dozens of game cards we eventually found, none of them were Atari winners. The best we did was win fries and a Coke or two, but we were almost too disgusted by McDonald's food trash by that time to eat any of it. As the summer passed, so did those Atari computer dreams. And by the time we were back in school in the 7th grade, the idea was pushed back, but not forgotten. That year, I quit Spanish class after one trimester and found myself working in the school computer lab. For an hour a day, I was allowed to explore a room filled with Apple IIe computers and pretty much do whatever I wanted. It was the next big revelation. I played expansive computer games, programmed in BASIC, drew pictures with the Koala art tablet, and wrote poems with Bank Street Writer. It became obvious to me in that lab that computers were not just another unattainable thing I was obsessed with, but they were the future. Not just my future, not just the future Eric's dad had given us a glimpse of, but the future for everyone. This realization only made my desire for a computer burn even more brightly. If only I could get my hands on one in my own room and learn how to program it, I'd be set for life. But Christmas 1982 came and went. We received a couple great Atari VCS games, River Raid and Vanguard, but much of our household, especially my dad, was distracted by moving my grandmother out of her house and into a retirement home. Early in 1983, my brother and I managed to save up and purchase a Starpath supercharger for our Atari VCS. The supercharger added about 6K of RAM to the VCS and loaded games from cassettes, like many home computers did. This meant the VCS could play more elaborate games loaded from tape in multiple segments. The games were also cheap, running about $15 each. For a hot minute, I believed that the supercharger might be a reasonable stand-in for an actual computer. The games it played, especially the first console RPG Dragon Stomper and the 3D maze game Escape from the Mind Master, were mind-blowingly great. However, that idea was short-lived. We still could not program the supercharger, and very soon after we purchased it, the company who made it, Arcadia Starpath, went out of business. In fact, Atari was losing money hand over fist in 1983 and felt like the entire video game industry was going to crumble. We needed to figure out how to get a computer fast, or there was a good chance we'd never get a chance to work making video games at all. By mid-1983, my brother and I had been obsessing about owning a computer for almost 3 years. I don't know if it's a scientific fact that 3 years in kid time is at least 30 years in adult time, but it sure felt like it. Bill Bryson said it most eloquently in his memoir, The Life and Times of the Thunderbolt Kid, like this: "Time moves more slowly in kid world. It goes on for decades when measured in adult terms. It is adult life that is over in a twinkling." It was about that time that Atari announced a brand new line of low-cost computers. The XL line consisted of the Atari 600 and the 800 XL, replacements for the Atari 400 and 800 respectively. Both had sleek new designs. Straight edges replaced the space-age curves of the older machines, with 64K RAM and BASIC built in. In mid-1983, our dad was working overtime at Hughes Aircraft with a new computerized CAD-CAM system. Without any real acknowledgement of the computer obsession we've been trying to show him for years, he started coming home and bestowing upon us his wisdom of the virtues of this new computer system and how computers were going to change everything. He sounded a bit like Eric's dad did a few years back. This was new. As well, with his overtime work, he seemed to have a bit more cash even if we never saw much of it. My dad had been going full bore into his new hobby, collecting Civil War headgear. We'd attended several gun shows, helping with his search, and he was obsessive about the classified ads and shotgun news, searching them for hours, looking for hats, buttons, belts, ammo holders, and any other period items from the 1860s that would satisfy his collecting hobby. His bookshelves are filled with antique books that describe Civil War uniforms in detail and first-hand accounts written by the soldiers themselves. He also imagined himself in a business making reproduction Civil War kepis and bummers, the names of his favorite forage caps, and his walls were filled with drawings and designs of the different parts of hats and how he might go about recreating them. All these antiques he bought ate heavily into the household income. Even though my mom took as many hours at her teacher's aide job as she could, we were still left buying most of our clothes at discount shops and our shoes at the local swap meet. This made it very hard for us to fit in with the expensive surf clothes wearing kids at junior high. We were nerds, but we didn't even even realize it. We just knew we wanted a computer. My brother and I decided it was time to finally tell our dad about the Atari we've been coveting. With my dad openly talking about computers now, it felt like we had some common ground to start a discussion. Unconsciously, I believe, our goal was to appeal to a sense of his own obsessions. We needed to try to make our desire for an Atari computer look and feel like his own hobbies. Those hobbies appeared legitimate because they had dedicated magazines, clubs, books, trade shows where enthusiasts could gather and explore together. I still recall us taking our stacks of books, magazines, catalogs, and notebooks filled with handwritten basic code into his room. He was on his bed, as usual, watching the black and white TV he repaired after going to night school. This is when my mom still slept there. Her things still occupied half the room. Her hairbrush and mirror still on their shared dresser, next to the giant mirror with the enormous crack in the upper left corner. "Hey, Pop," one of us said, "can we show you something?" We didn't just show him something, we showed him everything. Especially focused on the magazines and their pictures and ads for Atari, which I only now realize was a parallel to how he focused on shotgun news for his hobby. We pointed out the new, lower-cost Atari computers that had been announced that year. He watched us as we paged through the books we checked out, the programs we had written, and displayed our code and pixel drawings, plus the catalogs and magazines we had about Atari. Our dad was blown away by our enthusiasm, but he was still not sure Atari was a company that were serious about making computers. The one thing he did do, at least for a short time, was stop talking about Skid Row. It was a small thing, but just noticeable enough to encourage us to keep trying for an Atari 800 XL. So we stepped up the pressure another notch. We had to somehow get him to understand that not only did Atari make the best computers in the world and that they played the best games, but just having one could be our ticket to never worrying about having a job or being laid off, something he worried about constantly. Soon after, we begged our dad to take us to a computer show at the LA Convention Center. We saw an ad for it in the LA Times, and we imagined it would be like the CES or Comdex shows we read about in magazines. It was also the closest cousin to the gun shows to which we accompanied my dad when he was looking for Civil War artifacts. By taking us to those gun shows, he opened our eyes to the fact that these types of events existed. We planned to explore the Atari booth at the show and make sure he knew that Atari made serious computers and were a serious player in the industry and not just the video game system we had hooked up to the TV. We didn't know much about computer shows at the time, and it turned out that the one we chose was serious all right, and it covered IBM PCs only. Atari was nowhere to be found. I still recall my brother and I walking through the tables on the show floor, desperate to see any Atari machines anywhere so my dad could see that they were serious and real, but none were found. My dad was livid. He spent money on tickets, parking, and gas, and we came away with nothing. It was a huge blow to our dream, and it was the first time I realized that while I might have high regard for Atari computers, there was a whole industry that didn't even acknowledge their existence. Maybe we were wrong about Atari. It was near this time that my dad came home from work completely frustrated. He relayed a story to us about his computer at work and how it had turned on him. Whatever system he was using apparently did not have a backspace, which is either an actual backspace or his way of describing undo. When I'm drafting by hand, I can just erase with a pencil, but with this computer, I have to start all over again. I hate these computers. It was yet another blow to our efforts. We thought our dad had embraced the future, but it looked like he was quickly slipping into the past. We needed to find something else to send things in the other direction, and in the summer of 1983 we found it. SPACE, S-B-A-C-E, the South Bay Atari Computer Enthusiasts, was an Atari computer club that held monthly meetings a few miles from our house. Jeff and I found about them in an Atari computer magazine, and took our analog, both of which we bought regularly. We showed our dad the date and time for the meeting, and he agreed to take us. I was nervous about going to the space meeting. I felt like a kid entering an adult world. We paid our dues and sat down in the folding chairs in a room about 50 feet long and 25 feet wide. We were about 15 minutes early, so I watched as the other attendees arrived. I was relieved to see that most of them looked a lot like my dad. Still, I tried to make myself small and invisible in the chair, just in case. When one of the arrivals stopped next to us and turned to my dad, I was scared crapless about what he was going to say. The man leaned over to my dad, pointed to us, and said, "I see you got a couple Atari computer fans there. Welcome." My dad nodded, and the man nodded back, and that was that. We were good. The rest of the meeting was breathtakingly brilliant. There was talk of Atari BBS systems coming online, where to buy Atari computers, demos of games and programs written by members, and much more. All of these adults, and a few kids, talking about Atari computers as if they were the most important computers in the world. When it was over, I'm not sure how my dad felt about the meeting. He got up and immediately went to the back of the room. I thought he was trying to leave, but instead he headed straight to the membership table and bought us each a year's membership to Space. Sure, it wasn't like being a member of a cool 70s desert motocross racing club named the Dusters, but it was the closest we were ever going to get. On the way home, it felt like my dad was just as excited about his computers as we were. Our joyful conversation in the cab of the four-door International pickup truck traveled from computers to our futures as adults. With computers and soccer, you could be set for life, I recall him telling us, your mind and body fulfilled. We swept him up in our computer dream, telling him about how we could grow up to be programmers, a sellable skill, and not be bored with work because computers were cool, and not end up on Skid Row because we would get paid. He seemed to buy every word. By the time we made it home, he was sold. That night, he joined us on our quest to make the Atari computer dream a reality, and even better, he wanted to do it by Christmas 1983. I felt then that the upcoming Christmas was going to be the best Christmas ever.
In the fall of 1983, I stood before Star Wars, the arcade game. The ending battle of Star Wars, the original Star Wars, in video game form, and the chance to finally recreate the magic I dreamed about when I was 7 years old. But now finally, I could play it out. And it was brought to me directly from Atari, still the leader in video games. I waited my turn to play the Star Wars arcade game, and when the machine was open, I dropped a couple quarters in, and the magic unfolded. The controls were easy to manipulate. The fire buttons were placed right where your index finger could naturally wrap around the half steering wheel shaped controller. You could fire as many lasers as you wanted. No need to worry about energy or overheating. This was Star Wars. Actual Star Wars music blared from the game speakers. It was like no game I could recall before it. The music appeared to match the gameplay, like it was playing for me and scoring my own actions. In my first game, I did not realize you could shoot the astra-shaped fireballs shot at you by the TIE fighters, and my game ended before I could reach the Death Star. I watched over the shoulder of the next guy playing and saw him actually concentrate on the enemy fire, not the ships themselves. By doing that, he was able to both defend his ship and shoot down Imperial ships. I noted the strategy from my next game. In that game, I fought through the onslaught of TIE fighters guarding the Death Star by using the shoot the fireball strategy, and soon I was inside the trench gunning towards the exhaust port. My shield counter read 5, which meant I could get hit a few more times before my game was over. Shooting the TIE fighters was nothing short of exhilarating. They did not just explode, as you might expect from a video game at the time. Instead, they blew apart, the stabilizers and the parts of the cockpit falling away in what looked like random directions. It was, without a doubt, the most satisfying video game explosion experience ever created. The exploding TIE fighters reminded me of the hundreds of pencil drawings I made back in the 2nd and 3rd grade of elaborate space battle between TIE fighters and X-Wings. At one point, the TIE fighters appeared to fall back to the Death Star, and Luke Skywalker said, "This is Red 5, I'm going in." As I arrived in the trench, Obi-Wan said through the game speakers, "Use the Force, Luke." I spent so many years, so much of my youth, imagining I was playing Star Wars. All the video game surrogates were with me as I gunned it down the trench towards the exhaust port. I was so transfixed on trying to find the final target to shoot that I didn't notice the fireballs coming at me. I watched my shield counter drop from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 before I caught on and started shooting the fireballs and the guns that were shooting them instead of trying to dodge them. Abruptly, an area of the trench appeared with tons of guns on either side, but they were not firing, and I felt like something was happening. "Yahoo! You're all clear, kid," came the voice of Han Solo, and I saw a rectangle on the floor of the trench before me, the exhaust port. I did not know what to do, so I shot furiously at the 4, and I did it. The game view pulled back from the Death Star, and the deadly space station exploded in brilliant, satisfying circles of light. Red, blue, white. I blew up the Death Star. Then Obi-Wan Kenobi said to me, "May the Force be with you." I didn't pretend to do it while playing Asteroids and Galaga. I did it for real. Well, as real as possible. It was my finest moment at the arcade. And when I think about it, maybe it was my finest hour as a kid ever. Right then, I no longer needed Star Wars. In a very real way, my childhood was over. I was done playing Star Wars. I was done pretending and imagining I was a space hero that saved the universe. The richness of Star Wars that kept me awake at night as a 7-year-old boy now seemed like a tired old toy compared to the relative excitement of MTV, New Wave, burgeoning 80s teen culture, and the advent of the computer revolution. It was time to move on. The arcade and video games finally gave me what I wanted. The promise had been fulfilled. It was time for me to take the reins myself.
In the months that led up to Christmas 1983, we made attack plans on how we would make the Atari computer plan a success. We listed all the things we would need: a shiny new Atari 800XL, a 1050 disk drive, a box of 10 blank discs, and a color TV for output on a proper computer desk in our room. My dad took care of the color TV by setting us up with a refurbished one he repaired from someone else's garbage. Jeff and I loved the all-wood computer desk that Eric's dad had set up for his Apple IIe, and the giant fancy office desk Wesley had in his room for his IBM PC. We showed my dad pictures of computer desks in the Sears catalog, but he had his own ideas. He did the best he could for us given his other priorities. He found an old discarded desk on the side of the road and took it home with him one night, hauling several pieces in the back of his pickup truck. He salvaged the metal desk drawers and added a tabletop from some discarded boards in the garage. Then he fashions a set of legs with 2x4s for the side opposite the drawers to keep it upright. It was not pretty, but it certainly would not stand out in our house filled mostly with other discards, side-of-the-road specials, makeshift beds, etc. In fact, it was right at home. Now we just needed to find a computer that could sit on top of it. Throughout the fall, we kept looking for the best prices on Atari machines. Every week we check ads in the LA Times and take a trip to Fedco and Gemco to see if shipments of 800XLs had arrived. Our fellow members of Space relayed their own stories, and at one of the meetings in late 1983 we found out why. One of the speakers informed the attendees that Atari was having some kind of production problems and their computers were slow to arrive in the USA. What we didn't know was that in 1983 Atari had cut costs and moved their manufacturing to Asia. They also got a new CEO who halted all production for a short time so he could make sense of the mess the previous CEO left behind. Both of these events left the store shelves bare of Atari computer products in the run-up to Christmas. It couldn't have come at a worse time. Even though my dad was ready to make a purchase, simply finding an Atari 800XL computer anywhere became a huge problem. As the weeks before Christmas turned into mere days, the outlook became bleaker and bleaker. There were none to be found in any local stores. On Christmas Eve, we still had no computer purchased, but we took one last trip to Fedco just for the hell of it. It was Saturday, December 24th, and it just so happened to be the same day that Fedco finally received their first shipment of Atari 800XL computers. The store shelves were packed to the rafters. We were amazed and dazed. Our dream of almost 4 years was coming true, and on Christmas Eve, my brother and I ran around the aisles gleefully picking out everything we needed. I still recall the joy we felt when we finally saw the boxes for the 800XL and the 1050 disk drive. It felt like a Christmas miracle. I still recall what happened next. As if in slow motion, the movement of my dad, the expression on his face, the surprise of what he was seeing. I can see it now and will never forget it, because it was not joy he was expressing. My father was not enthusiastic about finding Atari computers at all. He looked quite shocked, actually, that the store had anything in stock, almost like he planned to not find anything there. As we dashed around the store, he finally got up the nerve to give us the news he'd been holding back. Boys, I can't buy this Atari 800XL this year. I didn't get enough overtime pay to afford one. We'll have to do it next year. And that was that. In a word, my brother and I were devastated. We went home and sulked. Christmas was ruined, and there was nothing we could do. I wish our dad had never latched onto our plan, as it only raised our hopes to dash them in the worst way possible. Why had he just gone through the motions of pretending to want this for us? I'd never been more angry at him. Like every year, we went to Catholic church with my mom that Christmas Eve, and as we exited to the verses of Joy to the World, the feeling of Christmases of old swept over me. By the time we got home, I felt warm and happy. It was nice to be at our house, and nice to know that Christmas was just a few hours away. My granny and sisters were home when we got back, and we soon got caught up in the evening. It was Christmas, by God, and would still be fun, as it always was. My mom, my wonderful mom, could not help but make it nice. Her little traditions were the heart and soul of our Christmas anyway. There would be no computer, but there would be Christmas stockings filled with thoughtful goodies from her paycheck. There would be biscuits for breakfast and turkey for dinner. And since the holiday fell on a Sunday that year, we still have 2 full weeks to play with whatever we received. Even without a computer coming, we still might get some Atari VCS or Vectrex games, and that couldn't be all bad. Maybe a ColecoVision was in our future. Sleep that night, though, was tough. It was not the usual Christmas Eve jitters from when I was little, but something more. All the pent-up energy and feelings from years of hoping, planning, and scheming to get that Atari computer were poured into twisted dreams about the Atari Christmas gone awry. Asleep, awake, asleep, awake, with dreams in between about what could have been. More thoughts came. Darker thoughts. I was angry when I thought about my dad's hobbies. There were still 4 motorcycles in the garage that he didn't ride anymore. His room was stuffed with artifacts that he had purchased to feed his Civil War habit. Yet our family still lived mostly makeshift. We rode makeshift bikes. We slept on makeshift beds. We wore makeshift clothes. Had a makeshift TV set that sat on an empty, makeshift computer desk. The plumbing, electricity, windows, floors, and paint in our house were bandaged with makeshift patches but never really fixed. My dad's hobbies were always fully funded, though. Why couldn't he just put aside some of that stuff just once? Just this once, to help us achieve this Atari computer dream. His hobbies seemed to be his priority. When would we be his priority? Even when he coached our soccer team, it felt sometimes like the strategy of putting together the lineups was more important to him than spending time with my brother and I. Like, he'd still be doing it even if we never showed up anymore for practice or games. To say I was never sure my dad loved me was a pretty accurate statement. It was always a mystery to us just how he felt about anything or anyone. He neither conveyed his emotions as the thoughtfulness of a romantic, which he was not, nor the overwrought bigness of an alcoholic, which he also was not. Instead, he showed that he cared with the subtle gestures of a prestidigitator, so small as to be merely experienced out of thin air. Getting that Atari computer, and more specifically my dad giving it to us on Christmas, had become in my mind the proof that I needed that I was okay, that my brother was okay. It would be the absent hug I always wanted from him, wrapped up neatly in a bow and placed under our Christmas tree. It would have proven once and for all that he didn't actually think I would ever end up on Skid Row, that the future was here, and that he believed truly in his heart that I would be part of it. But that was a can kicked down the road for another time. I'd have to live with it, and by the time I finally drifted off to sleep that night, a sense of restful peace came over me. Maybe we could get an Atari computer for our birthday, which was less than a month away. Dreams don't die, I guess. They have a way of morphing and adjusting to the realities of life. I still plan to learn to program a real computer, and I still plan to one day work for Atari, and I still plan to never end up homeless. I just didn't want this dream to die like I saw my mom's acting dreams die. If it did, what would be my solitaire at the kitchen table? What would be the thing I wasted my days away doing because I never got the chance to do what I felt was my destiny to do? The morning of Christmas 1983 and the next 2 weeks are a complete blur in my mind. For how precisely I remember the events that led up to Christmas 1983, the events afterwards live in a state of suspended animation, where all memories seem to rest on top of one another, as if they all happened at the same time. Some scientists theorize that time never actually passes, but simply folds over and over onto itself. If there ever was any anecdotal evidence to support this idea, it would be my Christmas 1983. My brother and I awoke that morning, and things were just as my father had said. There was no Atari 800XL computer, and there was no Atari 1050 disk drive. There was no shiny new computer software in elaborately shaped packages or brand new books and manuals for us to read about our new computer. Instead, there was something else entirely. There were 2 giant old-style 1970s Atari computer boxes, one for an Atari 800 and one for an 810 disk drive. Next to those boxes was another plain brown cardboard box. None of it was wrapped, just hurriedly placed on the table for us to find. My brother and I were in complete shock. Our father had not lied to us. It was true. He could not afford an Atari 800XL, an Atari 1050 disk drive, or brand new computer games. Instead, he got us an old Atari 800? He got the wrong one, I said aloud. I tried to smile, but it was tough. Was this another one of my dad's cheap fake-outs instead of the real thing? Another bargain? Another makeshift way to solve a problem? Another situation that left us behind the times instead of in front of them? I examined the Atari 800 box. It looked fairly new, but the side said it had only 16K of memory. That meant it was a 1979 vintage Atari 800. The new sleeker Atari 800XL had 4 times as much memory. The 800XL also had the new GTIA graphics chip that was lacking in the original Atari 800 models. Next to the Atari 800 box was a box for the 810 disk drive. The drive was built like a tank, but almost as big as one. The 810 was okay, but it was only single-sided, single density, so it could only store 90K on a disk. The newer 1050 XL drive was a superior enhanced density for more storage. My brother and I had studied enough magazines and heard enough at the space meetings to know how much better the XL computers were supposed to be than the old 400 and 800. However, it was not all bad. The cardboard box behind the Atari boxes appeared to be filled with all kinds of extras, like books and discs. Now that was intriguing. Even though we were both puzzled by the gift, when my dad came out of his room about an hour later, we put on our happy faces and thanked him profusely. Then he told us what happened. He told his buddy at work, Dave Elwood, about the Atari we wanted, and Mr. Elwood informed him that he had one already and he wanted to upgrade to an IBM PC. So Elwood sold him the older model Atari 800 and an older model 810 disk drive and all the software he collected for 3 years. It was a very good price, my dad said. Yep, a f***ing bargain, I thought to myself. I do not recall anything else at all from that Christmas morning except the building anticipation that I could not wait for all the present opening to complete so I could get to those computer boxes and see if the day could be salvaged. The exact moment the last piece of wrapping paper was thrown into the green trash bag and my dad fired up the Pioneer receiver to put on Christmas music, my brother and I whisked that Atari back to our room to check it out. We approached the computer with trepidation. The boxes were dusty and showed the wear of being in storage for a while. They were a far cry from the brand new shiny Atari XL boxes we saw at Fedco the day before. When we took out the equipment and cables, instead of the fresh smell of new plastic, they had the distinct sweet odor of old leather and cigar smoke. The machines were mostly clean though, and Mr. Elwood had upgraded the memory to 48K and the CTIA chip to a GTIA chip. So that was good. We placed the computer on our makeshift computer desk, hooked it up to our makeshift TV, and never, ever looked back. It turned out, rather unexpectedly, that buying Elwood's secondhand Atari was a brilliant idea. In the extra cardboard box came the spoils of Mr. Elwood's own foray into home computing that was now passed on to us. It contained discs and cartridges and joysticks and books and manuals and catalogs. There was so much stuff it was overwhelming. It would take us weeks or even months to discover it all. Over the first couple hours of testing the machine, our excitement built rapidly. In fact, there was something very special about the Atari computer system that my dad got for us. Far from being a poor substitution for a shiny new machine like we feared, it was, quite possibly, the greatest idea my dad ever had. The second-hand Atari 800 was like an instant starter set into the world of home computing. It was honestly the best gift a couple of 13-year-old Atari-obsessed computer twins in 1983 could ever hope for. If we had received a new Atari 800 XL, I'm not sure it would have had the same ultimate effect on us. Instead of starting new with just a few programs and games for our computer, we quite literally dove into the middle with so much available to explore it felt like an actual goldmine. Like all the listings and descriptions in that HW computer catalog, the one that we read over and over until it fell apart, those had become real, materializing right before our eyes on Christmas morning. My dad had come through. He had finally come through. His bargain hunting and frugal nature, in this case, turned out to be the linchpin. It was the very thing that made the Atari computer he gave us on Christmas 1983 so damn wonderful. We dove into that computer and all the riches it held and did not come up for air until 2 weeks later when we had to go back to school. We fired up DOS, read through the book Your Atari Computer, and typed in many basic programs. Mr. Elwood collected dozens of games and we tried them all. Every Zork adventure, every Scott Adams adventure, all the Atari created arcade translations, Star Raiders, and tons of others. We even explored financial programs, graphics demos, the realms of the public domain, and everything in between. Days passed quickly into nights and nights into days. Meals were skipped or forgotten. Bathing was left to the vain. Anything that would take us away from that Atari computer for more than a short time was pushed off as long as possible. The 2 weeks of vacation felt like a single, long, amazing day. We discovered everything we ever wanted to know about owning our own computer because now we had one in our own room. It was unthinkable. It was unfathomable. Yet there we were. Our hopes had been fulfilled. It was the last pure moment I ever knew as a child. The joy of complete intellectual and sensory discovery. The computer held the promise as a device that would entertain us as much as we could control it. We could mold it into whatever we wanted or needed. It was seemingly an unlimited tool for playing, learning, and creating. The best part was my dad got it for us, and to me, that meant he must have loved us, right? Even though he never actually said it, his intentions were obvious, and he didn't mention Skid Row for many years after that. Seeing that Atari computer on my computer desk when I woke up the day after Christmas in 1983 and realizing it was real and the dream had been fulfilled was one of the most indescribable feelings of elation I have ever experienced. It was bested only by falling in love with my wife for the first time and having my first child. Decades later, I still feel the same way. The discoveries and life lessons of that Christmas stand out. I look back on that Christmas to remind me of the reasons why I still play games and program computers for a living. There was always the hope of the next great discovery just around the corner. The idea that I will unearth something so engrossing, so intellectually stimulating, that I will dive into its all-encompassing void, only to lift my head up when I found the riches inside. And then I think of my parents. Our love of computers, no matter how much it burned in us, never rubbed off on them. My mom still played analog games of solitaire at the same place at the kitchen table well into her 80s until she could no longer see the cards. She never, ever, not even once, touched a computer, no matter how hard I tried to get her to do it. My dad did try, but it was not for him. The physical world of his Civil War come French Foreign Legion obsession never abated. He longed to find and understand the vibes he felt for the past. The future honestly did not interest him. My dad still wore a Civil War hat on his head every day until the moment he died in his living room. But none of that stopped us, and none of it would ever make me forget the most important moment of that Christmas day in 1983. The one moment in a blur of memories I recall precisely. It's an image that sticks in my mind and never goes away. It was in the evening time. Darkness had flooded the inside, and as always, the minimal lighting from the sketchy electricity in our house was trying to hold it at bay. My stomach was full of my mom's food, and the house was warm and cozy from the forced air heater, plus the smells of leftovers and French apple pie. Everyone in our house had retired to their happy places. Another Christmas over and in the books. Our family on their best behavior for a single day out of the year, now allowed to mostly ignore each other for the next 364. In our tiny cramped room, my brother and I sat side by side and booted up that Atari 800, the basic cartridge inside. We tried mostly games in the morning, but now wanted to get serious and try some code. The blue glow of the Atari basic screen lit up our faces in our darkened room. I typed our first basic code from one of Elwood's books, and Hello World filled up the screen. Then we edited the program to make our own version. It was just a small change really, but it was our change. All those years of writing code in notebooks and stealing time from friends' computers and the computers in the lab at school were over. The code we wrote was a simple message that said everything. Hello, Steve and Jeff. I'm your Atari computer. Jeff typed run, and the message filled the screen. We saved the program to a 90K single-sided, single-density disk on the 810 disk drive so we could keep it forever. And that was it. We had done it. Our plans had worked. We were computer programmers, or at least we had the tools and desire to become computer programmers. I instinctively knew at that moment nothing, and I mean nothing in life, would ever be the same again. The power sat on my desk that day to forge my own destiny. It was an amazing moment when I truly believed, with the computer in my hands and a dream in my head, anything was within my grasp. And that's why I believe Christmas 1983, the Atari Computer Christmas, was the best Christmas ever.
Epilogue, the home computer generation. When I graduated from 8th grade in the spring of 1984, I knew who and what I wanted to be. I wanted to make games for Atari. But over the summer, Atari transformed. Just as my brother and I were learning to program BASIC on our Atari 800, the original company evaporated. In July 1984, Warner Communications offloaded the consumer division of Atari. While a couple different companies continued to create products for many years under the Atari name, they were never again the Atari I fell in love with as a kid, nor were they the Atari I would ever want to work for. This event had an undue effect on my future, as my, albeit silly in retrospect, notion to work for Atari evaporated before my eyes. For the next 4 years in high school, I was confused. I continued to program in BASIC and dream of making little games, but there was never a strong pathway like there was in 1983. By the time I started college in 1988, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but the computer bug never left, and soon I found myself in the Long Beach State's MIS program with a knack for system design and databases, and I graduated cum laude with a degree in data processing. All of a sudden, computers were back in my future again, and when the World Wide Web came a few years later, I was ready, self-taught in the home computer age, trained in the age of data, and ready to ride the wave of Web 1.0 for the next decade. With my Atari home computer, I learned programming, but I also learned to make computer art. I learned how to make animations, learned how to write and edit with word processors. I learned how to create databases. I learned the basics of simple networking and computer maintenance, and so did many others. A legion of enthusiast scripters, gamers, and fledgling digital artists, all of them ready to take on the age of the internet. And that's the path I've taken for the rest of my life. So what happened to my dream about making games and working for Atari? Well, around the year 2000, my twin brother and I were both working at a large toy company, making consumer websites for various toy brands. One thing led to another, and soon we were asked if we could make games for those websites. We suddenly found ourselves at the right place and the right time to make our game development dreams come true. We formed a game development team out of web programmers, took the initiative, and proved we could make games for the websites. Our 8-bit computer game experience and skills came in handy too, because those early games had to be very small, and we borrowed all sorts of ideas for programming and the game design itself from those heady days in the 80s. All told, we created over 200 games in a 10-year period, before mobile gaming put web games mostly out of business. Sure, the games are not made for Atari exactly, but they were played by millions of kids hundreds of millions of times, and that was good enough for me. Then we started our own little game company, and in 2012 got the chance to participate in the Atari Pong Developer Challenge, created by the new Atari. If we won, we'd actually be working for them. We submitted a proposal. It took all of Atari's history and rolled it into a single-player Pong adventure. And Atari liked it. We made the semifinals. We created a demo, and that's it. Another company won the contest. So what did Christmas 1983 really teach me? Well, decades later, when I was a parent of teenage kids, it finally struck me what happened. My dad gave up on his dreams, just for enough time to support ours. It was the turning point. It gave me my life and everything after. My brother and I were very, very lucky to get an Atari 800 for Christmas 1983. And we were lucky my dad put aside his needs to help us on our way. So when it came time for my kids to follow their dreams, it was easy to see the parallel. I tried to make sure they could also have the best Christmas ever by making sure to get them the things they really needed to follow their hearts. And to do that, I had to take a step back. I had to quit making games and take a stable job to pay the bills. And this meant no matter how many games I once made, Atari, even the new Atari, would never be in the picture. But I could clearly see it, how putting those needs aside and making my kids' dreams a reality was really the only way I could have the best Christmas ever. And you know what? I never once had to talk to them about Skid Row.
We were children of the Silicon Revolution, an X generation conscripted to fight the console and home computer wars. A product of an analog 70s childhood, we came of digital age in the 80s, believing we could affect the world 8 bits at a time. Armed with joysticks, full-stroke keyboards, Jolt Cola, and MTV haircuts, we proceeded into the vertical blank. There, we stayed up late at night, devising incantations from D&D rulebooks and beginner's all-purpose symbolic instruction code. Video games were the match, and programming was the fuse, as the infinite possibilities of the digital world exploded into the internet age to come. We are Generation Atari.
Into the vertical blank.
We are the forgotten generation, a misplaced slice of the 20th century when birth rates were as low as expectations for the future. We lived under the threat of constant nuclear annihilation, playing outside, but always inherently knowing the future was indoors. We are the second half of Generation X. We were some of the first to play video games, to program home computers, and record CDs to cassette mixtapes. Our generation was nourished by new wave, imperfect punk rock, and John Hughes movies. We built Web 1.0 from the ground up using our childhood 8-bit and 16-bit programming skills. They call us Gen X. We prefer the vertical blank generation, where magic happens between the lines, because that's where we live, love, and thrive. We are Generation Atari.
Into the vertical blank.
The vertical blank is the space between the last line of the current frame and the first line of the next, where off-screen calculations create a cathode ray tube display. Exists literally between the lines, invisible yet all-seeing, in a void where magic occurs that is never seen, only experienced. The vertical blank is an omniscient force containing the nuances that make our nostalgia a reality. It's the transcendental location that holds our best memories, biggest joys, greatest fears, and our most terrible losses. You've been warned. You can stop this tape now, turn around, for once you've entered, there may be no escape. All the scan lines have been written. It's time to enter the vertical blank.
Into the vertical blank.
Next frame calculated. Prepare to write new data. V blank ending.